When I first moved into the quiet lakeside neighborhood, I thought I had found my little slice of peace away from the chaos of the city. The air was crisp, the trees were lush, and the water's reflection at sunrise felt like something out of a painting, but I should have known that where there's an HOA, there's always trouble brewing, and trouble had a name, Karen. She lived 3 houses down, her lawn trimmed within an inch of its life, her HOA badge always hanging from a lanyard like she was patrolling the grounds of the Pentagon, and from the very first day I pulled my moving truck into the driveway. She hovered like a hawk looking for prey, making welcome comments that felt more like thinly veiled threats, especially when she slipped in little remarks like, "We keep everything in order here, and it's important everyone follows." The rules were very strict. At the time, I brushed it off as nosy neighbor syndrome, but things escalated fast. Just 2 weeks into settling in, I got my first warning notice taped to my door claiming my mailbox wasn't HOA compliant even though it was the same. Model as half the street, and before I could even decide if I should laugh or get annoyed, I found another note the next day, this time accusing me of overdue HOA fees that apparently totaled $1,472, a bill I had never seen before, for a membership I hadn't even officially joined yet. Naturally, I marched down to the HOA office to clear it up, but that's when I discovered that office really meant Karen's converted sunroom, where she sat behind a desk stacked with manila folders like she was running a covert operation. She greeted me with that saccharine tone people use when they think they've already won, sliding the so-called bill toward me as if it was gospel. And when I asked for an itemized statement, she flipped to the back page where my name had been written in what looked suspiciously like fresh pen ink, not the kind of thing you'd expect from months of unpaid fees. I told her point blank there had to be a mistake because I had just moved in, but she gave me this little shrug, the kind that says, "Not my problem," and replied, "We hold residents accountable. If you don't pay, we take legal action." That's when I noticed something off. The bills in her folders weren't just for me. I recognized my neighbor Mike's name, the retired Navy vet 2 houses down, as well as the young couple across the street who had only moved in 6 months before, and all their amounts seemed oddly high, almost like Karen was running her own private revenue stream. Still, she ended the conversation by smugly handing me a final notice and warning me that she knew people at the county courthouse, implying she could get me arrested over this. Most people would have either paid to make the problem go away or ignored her entirely, but I've always been the kind of person who hates being accused of something I didn't do, so instead of getting angry, I got curious. That night, I started digging through my purchase paperwork and county records, and sure enough, the official HOA ledger listed my balance as 0. Not only that, but it showed no active debts for Mike or the young couple either, meaning every bill Karen had been waving around was fake. The next morning, I decided to talk to Mike, and it turned out he'd been dealing with the same nonsense for months. Karen had even threatened to put a lien on his house over unpaid landscaping fees. When his yard looked better than anyone's, he told me the couple across the street had received similar threats and were seriously considering moving just to get away from the harassment. That's when the pieces started falling into place. Karen wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was using her position to create bogus bills, hoping people would pay out of fear. And as much as part of me wanted to go straight to the police right then, I knew I needed proof that couldn't be brushed off as a misunderstanding, so I decided to set a trap. Over the next few days, I pretended to negotiate with her, asking if there was any way to reduce my fake bill, and she took the bait, telling me that if I paid in cash off the record, she could make the debt go away. A bold statement she made right there on her front porch, where my phone just so happened to be recording in my shirt pocket. I didn't stop there. I also contacted the county clerk's office and got certified statements proving the HOA's official balances, which clearly contradicted her claims. And I even managed to get Mike and the young couple to give me their own stories on video, all detailing the same pattern of bogus charges. By the time I had everything compiled, I had more than enough to expose her. But instead of going public right away, I decided to hit her where it hurt, the one place she couldn't talk her way out of, a courtroom. I filed a formal complaint with the County Fraud Division, attaching every shred of evidence I had, and within a week, an investigator contacted me saying my case was being taken seriously. Apparently, Karen already had a history of accounting irregularities from a previous HOA she'd run, but no one had ever gathered enough hard proof to nail her, until now. What she didn't know was that the court date she'd smugly threatened me with was about to become very real. Only she'd be the one sitting on the defendant's side, and I was ready to watch the whole facade come crashing down. Karen's smug expression at the police station the night before had been burned into my mind, and as I sipped my morning coffee, I promised myself she would regret trying to paint me as some kind of scam artist. She had strutted in there with a binder full of fake invoices, claiming I owed the HOA thousands in maintenance fees for landscaping, garbage pickup, and community improvements. Never mind that my property wasn't part of the HOA at all, and that my house was fully self-maintained with private waste service and a well-kept yard I mowed myself. Her whole plan had been to overwhelm me with bogus charges, so I'd either pay up to avoid embarrassment or get dragged into legal trouble. But what she didn't know was that I had kept every receipt, every service contract, and every piece of paper related to my home since I bought it, and I also had a growing suspicion that she was funneling HOA funds into her own personal expenses. The more I thought about her frantic insistence that the police do something immediately last night, the more I realized it was desperation, not confidence. She needed a win, and fast, probably because the noose was tightening somewhere else. So I spent the next few hours gathering documents, scanning them into my computer, and organizing them chronologically so that when I went to the police, I could hand them a neat, bulletproof packet that proved every single so-called bill she had waved around belonged to her, not me. The first big clue had been an invoice for $2,100 emergency plumbing repair. That was supposedly done at my address, but the date on it was during the week I was out of state, and the plumber's company name was one I recognized from a truck I'd seen parked in Karen's driveway more than once. I called the number on the invoice, and sure enough, the owner confirmed that they had never done work at my address, but had recently replaced an entire bathroom suite in a home matching Karen's description. When I asked if the client's name was Karen, he hesitated but eventually said yes, then added that she had given him an HOA check and told him to list the work under a shared property improvement, so she could get reimbursed. That was all I needed to connect the dots. I then moved on to the garbage pickup bills, which were in my name, but had a billing address that matched Karen's home. And the waste company rep I called seemed relieved when I explained the situation, saying they'd been trying to track down months of non-payment from her account, but she kept switching the name on the invoices. By the time I had compiled all this evidence, I had a small mountain of proof showing she had been shifting her own unpaid utility, maintenance, and repair costs onto other homeowners' names, hoping they'd either pay without question or fail to notice the charges until it was too late. Armed with this, I went straight to Officer Daniels, the same one who had been on duty last night, and placed the neatly organized binder on his desk, watching his eyebrows climb higher with each page. "This is a lot," he muttered, flipping through photographs, receipts, and statements I had printed. "And it's all tied back to her?" I nodded, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly realizing they'd almost arrested the wrong person because of her theatrics. He promised to escalate it to the fraud unit immediately, but I wasn't done. I also wanted to hit her where it hurt in the HOA itself. So I contacted 2 board members I knew from casual neighborly chats and set up a meeting at my place that afternoon. When they arrived and I laid everything out on my dining table, their faces turned pale, and they admitted they'd been wondering why the HOA budget had been running dangerously low despite increased fees. Turns out, Karen had been submitting reimbursement claims for all sorts of personal purchases, from home renovations to grocery store runs under the guise of community upkeep. I suggested they hold an emergency board meeting without her present, which they quickly agreed to, and within 2 days she was blindsided with a formal notice of suspension from her duties pending investigation. The day she received it, She stormed up to my porch and started screaming about how I had ruined her life. But this time, I didn't even bother to engage. I simply pointed to the security camera blinking above my door and told her she might want to save her breath for the court dates she was about to have. As she stomped away, the flashing lights of a patrol car turned the corner, and the officers inside weren't here for me. They were here for her. The courtroom was tense, the kind of quiet where you could hear the tick of the wall clock like a drumbeat before battle, and I could practically feel Karen's smug aura radiating from across the aisle as she sat beside her attorney, a man who looked like he was desperately wishing he'd called in sick. And when the judge entered, everyone stood. But Karen made a show of standing a second late, as if she were making some subtle point about authority, which only made her look like a petulant child. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, because while she had been parading around our neighborhood telling anyone who'd listen that I was a deadbeat who didn't pay my bills, I had been quietly gathering every receipt, every bank statement, every shred of proof that not only had I paid all my own bills in full and on time, but many of the bills she claimed were mine were actually hers, utilities tied to her address, subscription services linked to her email, even a massive repair invoice for her pool heater that she had somehow managed to have routed to my account because of a clerical error she'd likely manipulated. And when the judge asked her side to begin, her attorney stammered out a vague argument about pattern of non-payment and financial irresponsibility, showing a stack of papers that, from my seat, I recognized as the very documents I'd already flagged as fraudulent. I let him talk because I knew that the longer he dug himself into this pit, the harder it would be for them to climb out once I presented my evidence. And when my turn came, I stood calmly, handed the judge a neatly organized binder, and said, "Your Honor, not only have I paid every bill with my name on it, but I have evidence that most of the bills in question actually belong to the plaintiff, Ms. Karen Matthews," at which point I slid a second binder forward that was color-coded, with tabs, each one corresponding to a bill, a date, and a piece of evidence showing her as the true account holder. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly as he flipped through the first few pages, and Karen, who had been sitting upright and smug just minutes before, suddenly looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole, shifting in her chair and glancing at her attorney with the kind of panic you can't fake, because she knew exactly what was coming. Emails she had sent to service providers using my name, call recordings I'd obtained via public records requests where she tried to impersonate me to get accounts changed, and even a neighbor's security camera footage showing her taking mail from my box and later shredding it in her backyard, which, combined with the tampered billing history, made a pretty compelling case not just for fraud, but for possible mail theft, a federal offense. The courtroom murmured as I played the recordings, and the judge had to call for order, reminding everyone that this was still a formal proceeding, but I could see from his expression that he was already piecing together the kind of person Karen was, and it wasn't the innocent neighbor she'd painted herself as. When her attorney tried to object, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, I pulled out the final piece of letter from the electric company confirming in writing that the disputed charges were linked to her account, and that her own signature was on the service contract, not mine. And when the judge read that, he leaned back in his chair, looked at Karen over his glasses, and said, "Miss Matthews, I hope you understand the seriousness of what's being alleged here, because right now this evidence strongly suggests you've been engaging in fraudulent activity," and the way her face drained of color told me everything I needed to know. She muttered something about misunderstanding and clerical mix-up, but the judge wasn't having it, setting a continuation date so the DA could review the matter for possible charges. And in that moment, Karen's war on me had taken a sharp turn she hadn't planned for. Because what started as a petty HOA vendetta about so-called unpaid bills was now turning into a legal nightmare that could cost her far more than she'd ever imagined: her reputation, her seat on the HOA board, and maybe even her freedom. And as I walked out of that courtroom, binder under my arm, I knew Section 4 of this saga was about to get even more interesting, because the real fight was only just begin. Karen's arrest didn't magically make everything perfect overnight, but the silence that settled over the neighborhood afterward was almost deafening. like the air after a long thunderstorm, the kind where you can still smell the wet earth, and hear the last distant rumble, and for the first time in months, I could sit in my living room without jumping at the sound of tires on gravel or the sight of a letter stuck under my door. But of course, with the HOA board now partially dismantled, 3 resignations in a week, 2 suspensions pending investigation, there was a vacuum of control, and vacuums have a way of attracting either the best or the worst of people, and unfortunately the worst in this case came in the form of Martin, the HOA's self-proclaimed interim president, who clearly didn't read the room or the police report and started firing off urgent notices about lawn inspections and community aesthetic reviews, like the HOA wasn't hemorrhaging credibility faster than a sinking boat taking on water. But I wasn't about to sit back and let round 2 of this nonsense start. So I called the county commissioner who, by now, had my number saved and reminded him that not only was the HOA under investigation, but they were still technically in violation of multiple county codes because of their mishandling of the supposed debt collection program, which, as the county attorney confirmed in writing, was both unauthorized and illegal, making every bill they'd sent out not only void but actionable. So while Martin was busy strutting around like a peacock at the next board meeting, which had to be held in the clubhouse because their usual office was still under forensic audit, I slid in copies of my own filing civil suits, complaints, to the state HOA Oversight Committee, and a very polite but lethal letter from my lawyer outlining my intent to seek damages, not just for my trouble but for every other homeowner they'd harassed with fake invoices. And you could almost see the blood drain from Martin's face as he realized the HOA's legal defense fund was non-existent because Karen had been using it to pay off her own personal bills, which explained a lot. Within 2 weeks, the county froze their accounts, pending restitution, and the homeowners who had once muttered, "just pay it to avoid trouble," were now lining up to join my case, waving copies of their own fraudulent past due statements. It was like watching a school of fish suddenly realize they're bigger than the shark they've been running from, and the HO, stripped of its bite, started to crumble. Meetings canceled, emails unanswered, and the newsletter replaced with a 1-page apology signed by no one. But I wasn't done, not yet, because I knew Karen's court date was coming up, and when the day arrived, I took a seat in the gallery just to watch her walk in wearing the same smug expression she'd worn the day she tried to sic the cops on me, except this time it didn't last long, especially when the prosecutor opened with, "The defendant is charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and misuse of HOA funds," and began displaying evidence I'd helped provide, including the live recording of her trying to get me arrested for bills that were literally addressed to her. By the end of the hearing, the judge denied bail, citing her as a flight risk, and I couldn't help but notice she didn't even glance my way when she was escorted out in cuffs, which was fine by me because my satisfaction didn't come from her seeing me. It came from knowing she knew I'd been the one to dismantle her little empire. In the weeks that followed, the OAS charter was officially revoked. The property management contract was terminated, and the county announced that any community oversight moving forward would be voluntary and homeowner-led, meaning no more arbitrary fines, no more fake debts, and no more Karens pretending to wield legal power they didn't have. And on the day the locks were changed on the old HOA office, I stood there with a cup of coffee, watching the locksmith toss the keys into a bin marked for recycling, thinking about how quickly bullies crumble when you stop playing by their rules and start making them answer to real ones. And though I knew life in the neighborhood would never be perfect, at least it would be free, and that was worth every late night, every piece of evidence I collected, and every second I spent making sure people like Karen learned the hard way that some of us don't scare easy. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, and I sat there in my press suit, hands folded calmly on the table, while Karen, in a wrinkled floral blouse and a scowl that could curdle milk, was practically vibrating with rage across from me, muttering under her breath about how she was finally going to see justice served. The judge, an older man with a voice like gravel and eyes that could cut through lies like a hot knife, flipped through the file the clerk had handed him, pausing every now and then to glance up at the two of us, clearly taking in the bizarre dynamic before him. The prosecution, or rather the HOS attorney, because yes, they'd actually pushed this to a criminal complaint, stood with all the pomp and bluster of someone who thought this was an open and shut case. He launched into his opening statement about how I was a delinquent homeowner who had refused to pay mandatory HOA fees for several years, and that the total in arrears had ballooned into the tens of thousands, painting me as some freeloading squatter leeching off the hard-working residents of their precious subdivision. Karen's smug little side smile told me she thought the whole room was eating it up. I waited patiently, knowing exactly what was coming, because for weeks my attorney and I had been quietly compiling every shred of proof that not only was I up to date on all my legitimate bills, but that the very debts Karen was accusing me of were hers debts she'd managed to hide from the HOA board. Debts she'd cleverly tried to stick me with by forging paperwork and rerouting notices, and debts that, unfortunately for her, I had caught her red-handed trying to dump on me through my own security cameras and a series of very damning intercepted letters. When it was my attorney's turn, she stood calmly, flipped open a thick binder, and said, "Your Honor, my client is here today under false accusations, and we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that not only is he innocent of all alleged arrears, but that Mrs. Karen Whitmore here is the actual debtor in question." The sudden shift in the judge's expression told me I had his full attention now. My attorney began with the simplest piece of evidence: certified receipts showing my on-time payments to every legitimate service and utility for the last 5 years, then moved on to the certified letters from the HOA itself, acknowledging my account as current up until a certain date, the exact date when Karen somehow convinced the board to merge my lot's billing with her own under a supposed administrative error. Next came the security footage played right there on the court's monitor showing Karen creeping up to my mailbox with an envelope in hand, opening the flap, sliding in a notice addressed to me that had clearly been tampered with, then scurrying back to her car like a guilty raccoon. The gasps from the small audience in the back row were delicious. Karen shot to her feet, yelling, "That's not me! That's been doctored." But the judge barked, "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. You will have your turn." My attorney didn't even flinch. She just kept laying brick after brick of proof, the paper trail of forged signatures that matched Karen's handwriting, the financial records subpoenaed from the HOS accountant showing how Karen had been covering her own massive overdue balance by shifting it onto my ledger, and the final nail in the coffin, a recording of Karen bragging to another board member that she was finally going to bankrupt that cabin-dwelling nuisance and get his property for pennies when they foreclose. At that, Karen's face drained of color, her bravado replaced with the panicked look of someone realizing the noose had just tightened around her neck. The HOS attorney stammered something about needing to review this new evidence, but the judge wasn't having it. He turned to Karen and said in that gravelly tone, "Mrs. Whitmore, I am ordering you to provide a full accounting of your personal debts, and based on what I've seen today, I am inclined to believe you have willfully committed fraud, perjury, and possibly mail tampering, all of which carry significant penalties." Karen started sputtering, But he's lying. He's..." Before the bailiff stepped closer to her, a silent reminder to watch her mouth. Then came the ruling. All charges against me were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be brought again, and the HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees in full. But it didn't stop there. The judge also referred Karen's conduct to the district attorney for criminal investigation and issued a temporary restraining order, keeping her at least 500 feet away from me and my property. By the time we left the courthouse, Karen looked like she'd aged 10 years, while I walked out into the bright sunlight with the sweet taste of vindication in my mouth. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was nothing short of poetic. The HOA board, humiliated and scrambling to save face, held an emergency meeting to vote Karen out as president and strip her of all authority, but by then it didn't matter, because the DA's office had already filed formal charges against her for fraud and tampering. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and the same neighbors who used to nod politely at her now crossed the street to avoid being associated. When the trial date came for her criminal case, I didn't even have to testify. The mountain of evidence spoke for itself, and she ended up taking a plea deal that included restitution to me for the months of harassment and defamation. The irony: to pay me back, Karen had to sell her house, the same one she thought she was going to fund with my unpaid bills. Watching the moving truck pull up to her place while she stood on the curb, arms crossed and eyes full of resentment, was the perfect bookend to months of her scheming. And just to make sure the message was clear, I had my attorney send the HOA a formal letter stating that any future attempts to levy false debts against me would result in immediate legal action and public disclosure. Since then, my life at the cabin has been blissfully quiet. No more surprise notices. No more middle-of-the-night knocks. No more Karen, the new president, actually came by in person to apologize. And while I accepted, I also made it clear that my trust in them was shot. These days, I spend my evenings on the porch, coffee in hand, looking out at the lake and thinking about how close Karen came to ruining my life and how satisfying it was to turn the tables in such a spectacular, very public way. Some people say revenge isn't worth the trouble, but I say they've never watched their worst enemy pack up and leave town under the weight of their own lies.